Supply runs don't require a college degree, Lieutenant Colonel Brock muttered to his aide as Sergeant Elena Vasquez approached the logistics desk with her requisition forms. The woman's been here 6 months and still thinks she can waltz into briefings like she belongs. Staff Sergeant Torres nodded and chuckled quietly, already anticipating another entertaining display of the colonel's legendary impatience with support personnel who forgot their place. Elena heard every word. She had been hearing variations of the same dismissive comments since her assignment to Fort Meridian, each one delivered with the casual confidence of men who believed they understood exactly who she was and what she was worth. The morning sun streamed through the headquarters windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor where her boots made soft clicking sounds as she walked. The familiar weight of her service uniform felt different here than it had in other places, other assignments where her presence commanded a different kind of attention. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed similar situations in military communities where assumptions were made too quickly. Colonel Brock looked up from his paperwork as she reached his desk, his expression already set in the practiced look of barely contained annoyance that he reserved for what he considered administrative interruptions. "Sergeant, what can the United States Army do for you today?" His tone carried the weight of a man who had been interrupted from important work by someone whose concerns were decidedly less important. Behind him, 3 other officers continued their conversation about upcoming training exercises, their voices creating a backdrop of casual authority that seemed to emphasize Elena's position as an outsider seeking permission. Elena placed her requisition forms on the desk with deliberate precision, each movement controlled and professional despite the colonel's obvious impatience. "Sir, I need authorization for additional communications equipment for the Eastern Perimeter outposts. The current gear is insufficient for proper coordination during night operations." Her voice remained steady and respectful, though she could feel the familiar tension building in her shoulders as she prepared for the inevitable questioning of her judgment and authority. Torres leaned forward slightly, unable to hide his amusement at what he clearly expected to be another example of support staff overstepping their knowledge. "Communications equipment?" He glanced at Colonel Brock with the look of a man sharing an inside joke. Since when do supply clerks decide what's insufficient for operations they're not involved in? The question hung in the air with the confidence of someone who believed he had just made an excellent point that would quickly resolve this unnecessary interruption. Colonel Brock picked up the forms and scanned them with the hurried attention of someone looking for reasons to reject rather than approve. The requisition amounts made his eyebrows rise slightly, though whether from surprise at the cost or surprise at the scope was unclear. "This is pretty ambitious for routine supply requests, Sergeant. You sure you understand what you're asking for here? These aren't walkie-talkies from the motor pool." His fingers drummed against the desk as he spoke, a nervous habit that emerged whenever he encountered situations that didn't fit his expectations. Elena watched his reaction carefully, noting the slight pause before he had addressed her rank, the way his eyes had lingered on her nameplate, as if trying to reconcile her presence with his preconceptions. "Sir, I've reviewed the current equipment specifications against operational requirements. The frequency capabilities and range limitations create significant vulnerabilities that compromise mission effectiveness." Her explanation was precise and technical, delivered with the confidence of someone who had spent considerable time analyzing the situation rather than making casual observations. The colonel's expression shifted slightly, moving from casual dismissal towards something that might have been confusion or irritation. He set the forms down and leaned back in his chair, studying Elena with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite make sense. "Sergeant Vasquez," he said slowly, emphasizing her rank in a way that seemed designed to remind everyone present of the proper hierarchy. "Where exactly did a supply clerk learn to evaluate communications vulnerabilities and mission effectiveness?" His question carried an edge that suggested he found her competence more annoying than impressive. Torres sensed an opportunity to demonstrate his loyalty and understanding of the situation. "Colonel, Maybe we should have someone from communications review these requests. Someone with actual operational experience who can determine if these concerns are legitimate or if we're dealing with another case of enthusiastic overreach. His suggestion was delivered with the smooth confidence of someone offering a reasonable solution to an obvious problem, his tone suggesting that Elena's competence was more likely apparent than real. Elena felt the familiar weight of assumptions settling around her like a heavy blanket, each comment and glance adding another layer to the identity they had constructed for her. The morning light had shifted as they talked, and the shadows on the floor had grown shorter and sharper, creating stark lines that seemed to divide the room between those who belonged and those who were merely tolerated. She could hear the ongoing conversation behind the colonel, the casual discussion of training schedules and personnel assignments that continued as if her presence was a minor administrative detail rather than a matter requiring serious consideration. Colonel Brock tapped the forms against his desk, the rhythmic sound marking time as he considered his response. The sound echoed in the quiet space between Elena's request and his decision, a small percussion that seemed to emphasize the growing tension in the room. His aide shifted slightly in his chair, clearly expecting the colonel to deliver one of his famously decisive rejections that would quickly resolve this interruption and return them to more important matters. The very air seemed to hold its breath as Elena waited for his response, knowing that his next words would set the tone for everything that followed. Colonel Brock set the forms down with deliberate finality, the paper making a sharp sound against the wooden desk that seemed to announce his decision before he spoke. "Sergeant, I'm going to save us both some time here. These requests are denied. The equipment we have is adequate for current operations, and I'm not about to authorize expensive upgrades based on the theoretical concerns of support personnel." His words carried the weight of someone who considered the matter closed, his tone suggesting that further discussion would be both unnecessary and unwelcome. Torres nodded approvingly, clearly satisfied that proper order had been restored to what had briefly threatened to become an unnecessarily complicated situation. "Makes sense, sir. We can't have every clerk second-guessing operational decisions based on equipment manuals they've been reading." His comment drew a slight smile from the colonel, the kind of shared understanding between men who recognize the importance of maintaining clear boundaries between those who made decisions and those who implemented them. Elena remained standing at attention, her expression unchanged despite the dismissal. "With respect, sir, the vulnerabilities I've identified are based on field analysis, not manual reading. During last month's night exercises, communications failed at critical junctures that could have compromised mission success in actual combat situations." Her response was measured and professional, though something in her tone suggested that she was not as easily dismissed as the colonel might have expected. The colonel's smile faded as he realized that his decisive rejection had not achieved the desired effect of ending the conversation. His fingers resumed their drumming against the desk, the rhythm slightly faster now as his patience began to wear thin. "Sergeant Vasquez, are you questioning my operational assessment? Because it sounds like you're suggesting that I don't understand the communication needs of my own command." His voice carried a warning edge, the tone of someone who was prepared to escalate the situation if necessary to maintain his authority. Behind him, the other officers had stopped their conversation and were now listening with the focused attention of people sensing developing drama. Captain Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, clearly expecting to witness one of the colonel's legendary displays of authority that usually ended with subordinates remembering their proper place. Major Hendricks continued reviewing his paperwork, but his eyes remained fixed on Elena, his expression suggesting curiosity about how far she would push this increasingly tense exchange. Elena could feel the weight of their attention, the way the room had shifted from casual dismissal to active observation as her persistence challenged the colonel's expectations. "Sir, I'm providing tactical analysis based on direct observation of equipment failures that created operational vulnerabilities. The frequency limitations and range restrictions I've documented represent genuine security concerns that warrant consideration." Her voice remained steady, but there was something in her bearing that suggested she was not intimidated by the colonel's increasing irritation. Torres shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly sensing that the situation was moving beyond his understanding of how these interactions typically proceeded. "Colonel, maybe we should have communications run their own assessment to settle this matter." His suggestion carried the nervous energy of someone trying to de-escalate a situation that seemed to be spiraling beyond normal parameters, though his tone still suggested that Elena was the source of unnecessary complication rather than legitimate concern. Colonel Brock stood up from his chair, the sudden movement designed to emphasize his physical authority and signal that his patience had reached its limit. "Sergeant, I think there's been a misunderstanding about your role here. You process supply requests. You don't conduct tactical analysis. You don't evaluate operational vulnerabilities, and you certainly don't question command decisions about equipment adequacy." His words were delivered with the sharp precision of someone drawing clear lines that should not be crossed. The morning sun had shifted again, casting new shadows across the room that seemed to emphasize the growing divide between Elena and the men surrounding her. The light coming through the windows created stark contrasts on the floor, bright patches separated by dark areas that seemed to mirror the tension building in the space between respectful disagreement and open confrontation. The familiar sounds of base activity continued outside, trucks moving equipment and personnel going about their duties, creating a backdrop of normalcy that made the tension inside feel even more pronounced. Elena maintained her position at attention, though something in her posture suggested a readiness that went beyond standard military bearing. "Sir, my observations are based on 15 years of field experience across multiple deployment zones. The communication failures I've documented represent patterns that I've seen compromise operations in environments where equipment limitations had tactical consequences." Her response carried a quiet authority that seemed to surprise everyone in the room, including Torres, who was now looking at her with something approaching confusion. The colonel's face flushed slightly as he realized that Elena was not backing down despite his increasingly aggressive tone. His hands clenched slightly at his sides, the physical manifestation of frustration that was beginning to override his professional composure. 15 years? He repeated the phrase with obvious skepticism. "Sergeant, your personnel file shows 6 months at this assignment. Unless you're claiming some kind of classified background that somehow escaped my attention during your assignment briefing." His tone suggested that he found her claims not just unlikely, but potentially deceptive. Torres glanced between Elena and the colonel, clearly trying to process information that didn't align with his understanding of either her role or her background. Behind them, Captain Rodriguez had stopped pretending to focus on other matters and was now watching the exchange with the fascinated attention of someone witnessing an unexpected and potentially explosive confrontation. Major Hendricks had set down his paperwork entirely, his expression suggesting that he was beginning to suspect that this interaction was more complicated than it initially appeared. Elena's response came with the measured tone of someone who had spent considerable time choosing her words carefully. "Sir, my complete service record may contain information that wasn't included in standard assignment documentation. The equipment vulnerabilities I've identified represent genuine operational risks that could compromise mission effectiveness and personnel safety." Her words carried implications that seemed to hang in the air like smoke, suggesting layers of information that had not yet been revealed but might explain the growing tension in the room. Colonel Brock stepped around his desk, moving closer to Elena with the deliberate intent of someone using physical proximity to reassert dominance in a situation that was slipping beyond his control. The distance between them decreased to mere feet, close enough that his voice carried additional weight as he prepared to deliver what he clearly intended to be the final word on the matter. "Sergeant, I'm going to make this very simple for you." Colonel Brock's voice had dropped to a low growl as he positioned himself directly in front of Elena, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the small veins in his eyes that spoke of too many late nights and too much stress. "You're going to take these rejected forms, walk out of my office, and remember that supply clerks don't give tactical advice to combat officers. His words were delivered with the kind of quiet intensity that often preceded explosive outbursts, each syllable carefully enunciated to ensure maximum impact. Elena did not step back despite the colonel's aggressive positioning, her military bearing unchanged even as the situation deteriorated around her. She could feel the attention of every person in the room focused on this moment. The way conversations had stopped and breathing had become more deliberate as everyone sensed the approaching confrontation. Sir, the operational risks I've documented are legitimate concerns that require command attention. Equipment failures during critical operations have historically resulted in casualties that could have been prevented with proper communication capabilities. Torres stood up from his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating tension, but uncertain about how to intervene without undermining his superior's authority. Colonel, maybe we should review her personnel file more carefully before making final decisions about these requests. His suggestion carried the nervous energy of someone trying to de-escalate without fully understanding the source of the conflict, though his tone still suggested that Elena was the primary source of the problem rather than the colonel's increasingly aggressive response. The colonel's jaw tightened as he realized that Elena was continuing to challenge his authority despite his clear signals that the conversation should be over. His hands moved to his hips in a gesture that emphasized his physical dominance, while also bringing his arms into a position that suggested readiness for more aggressive action. Sergeant Vasquez, are you deaf or just incredibly stupid? I said this conversation is over. The equipment we have is adequate. Your analysis is unnecessary, and your continued presence in my office is becoming insubordinate. Captain Rodriguez shifted forward in his seat, his expression showing the first signs of genuine concern as he recognized that the situation was moving beyond normal disciplinary boundaries. Behind him, Major Hendricks had quietly moved closer to the phone on his desk, though whether from instinct or specific concern was unclear. The room's atmosphere had changed dramatically from casual morning business to something that felt charged with potential violence, the kind of tension that made everyone hyper-aware of their positioning and escape routes. Elena's response came with the same measured professionalism she had maintained throughout the encounter, though there was something in her eyes that suggested she was prepared for whatever escalation might follow. Sir, I understand your frustration with my persistence, but the safety implications of inadequate communications equipment warrant serious consideration regardless of the source of the analysis. Lives depend on reliable coordination during combat operations, and current capabilities fall short of minimum operational standards. The colonel's face flushed a deeper shade of red as Elena's continued resistance pushed him past the point of professional restraint. His voice rose to a level that could be heard clearly throughout the office, drawing attention from personnel in adjacent areas who were now aware that something significant was happening in the command center. You know what your problem is, Sergeant? You think 6 months of pushing paperwork makes you qualified to question 15 years of combat command experience. You think you can walk into my office and lecture me about operational safety like some kind of expert. Torres glanced toward the door, clearly hoping that someone with higher authority might intervene before the situation escalated further beyond his ability to manage or understand. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed harsher now, creating sharp contrasts that emphasized the growing divide between the colonel's position of assumed authority and Elena's unexpected resistance to his dominance. Outside, the normal sounds of base activity continued, but inside the office, everything had focused down to this single point of confrontation. Elena remained at attention despite the colonel's rising voice and increasingly aggressive posture. Her silence seemed to infuriate him further, as if her refusal to be intimidated represented a personal challenge to everything he believed about military hierarchy and respect. Sir, my recommendations are based on standard operational analysis that any communications specialist would recognize as legitimate safety concerns. The equipment failures I've documented are not theoretical issues, but actual incidents that compromised mission effectiveness during recent exercises. Colonel Brock stepped even closer, now invading Elena's personal space in a way that violated every principle of professional military conduct. His breathing had become more rapid, and there was something in his eyes that suggested he was approaching the point where rational decision-making might give way to emotional reaction. You want to talk about mission effectiveness? Let me tell you about mission effectiveness. Mission effectiveness means knowing your place, following orders, and not wasting command time with amateur analysis from personnel who should be focused on supply inventory rather than playing tactical advisor. The other officers in the room had now completely abandoned any pretense of conducting normal business, their full attention focused on the confrontation that was clearly approaching some kind of crisis point. Captain Rodriguez had moved his chair back slightly, creating more distance between himself and the escalating situation while maintaining visual contact with both participants. Major Hendricks had positioned himself closer to the communication equipment, his body language suggesting someone preparing for the possibility that outside intervention might become necessary. Elena's voice remained steady, even as the colonel's aggressive positioning made it clear that physical confrontation was becoming increasingly likely. Sir, I respectfully maintain that the communications vulnerabilities I've identified represent genuine operational risks that warrant command attention regardless of their source. Professional military analysis should be evaluated based on merit rather than assumptions about the analyst's background or current assignment status. Her words carried implications that seemed to suggest knowledge and experience that went far beyond what anyone in the room had previously assumed. The colonel's hands began to clench and unclench at his sides, a physical manifestation of barely controlled rage that was becoming increasingly difficult to contain within the bounds of professional conduct. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than his previous shouting. Sergeant, you have exactly 10 seconds to collect these forms and remove yourself from my office before I demonstrate what happens to insubordinate personnel who forget their place in this command structure. The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with the promise of immediate and potentially violent consequences. Torres stood up completely now, clearly recognizing that the situation had moved far beyond normal disciplinary procedures and was approaching territory that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. His face showed the strain of someone caught between loyalty to his superior and growing awareness that something was fundamentally wrong with how this confrontation was developing, though he remained uncertain about how to intervene effectively without making the situation worse. The 10 seconds stretched like an eternity as Elena remained motionless, her eyes meeting the colonel's furious glare with unwavering calm. Around them, the office had fallen into the kind of silence that precedes catastrophic events, the weight of impending violence pressing down on everyone present like a physical force. Torres found himself counting the seconds unconsciously, his breathing shallow as he watched his commanding officer teeter on the edge of a decision that would change everything. 7, 8, 9. Colonel Brock's face had gone beyond red into a deeper shade that spoke of blood pressure spiking beyond healthy limits. His entire body trembled with barely contained rage as Elena's continued defiance pushed him past every boundary of professional conduct he had ever maintained. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to highlight the sweat beading on his forehead, the way his uniform had begun to wrinkle under the strain of his clenched muscles. 10. You asked for this, Sergeant. The colonel's hand shot out faster than anyone expected, his palm connecting with Elena's face in a sharp crack that echoed through the office like a gunshot. The sound seemed to freeze time itself, creating a moment of absolute stillness where everyone processed what had just happened and what it meant for everything that would follow. Elena's head snapped to the side from the impact, but she did not stumble or cry out. Torres felt his stomach drop as he realized he had just witnessed his commanding officer commit an act that would end careers and possibly result in criminal charges. Behind him, Captain Rodriguez had gone completely still, his mouth slightly open as his mind struggled to process the implications of what he had just seen. Major Hendricks had already moved toward the communication equipment, his training taking over as he recognized that this situation had moved far beyond anything that could be handled at the local level. Elena slowly turned her head back to face the colonel, a red mark blooming across her left cheek where his hand had made contact. There was no anger in her expression, no surprise, no fear. Instead, there was something that looked almost like pity, the expression of someone who had just watched another person destroy their own career through a moment of uncontrolled rage. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the same measured professionalism it had maintained throughout the encounter. "Sir, you've just committed assault against a fellow service member in front of multiple witnesses. I strongly recommend that you step back and consider the implications of your actions before this situation escalates further." Her words were delivered with the calm authority of someone who understood exactly what had just happened and what consequences would inevitably follow, though her tone suggested more concern for the colonel's situation than anger about her own treatment. Colonel Brock stared at his own hand as if it belonged to someone else, the reality of what he had just done beginning to penetrate through his rage-induced haze. The office remained silent except for the sound of his heavy breathing and the distant hum of air conditioning that seemed suddenly very loud in the charged atmosphere. His face had gone pale now, the red flush of anger replaced by the grayish tone of someone beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. Torres cleared his throat nervously, his voice barely above a whisper when he finally found the courage to speak. "Colonel, sir, maybe we should call the military police and report this incident before it gets complicated by outside discovery." His suggestion carried the desperate hope of someone trying to find a way to minimize damage that had already been done, though his tone suggested he knew it was probably too late for damage control. Captain Rodriguez had pulled out his phone and was staring at it with the expression of someone trying to decide whether duty required him to make calls that would destroy his commanding officer's career. Behind him, Major Hendricks had moved to the window and was looking out at the base grounds with the focused attention of someone expecting to see official vehicles arriving at any moment. The normal sounds of morning activity continued outside, but inside the office, everyone seemed to be holding their breath. Elena reached up and gently touched the mark on her cheek, her fingers exploring the tender area with clinical detachment rather than emotional reaction. The gesture seemed to snap Colonel Brock out of shock, bringing him back to awareness of his surroundings and the people who had witnessed his loss of control. His eyes moved from face to face, seeing his own career destruction reflected in their shocked expressions and uncertain glances toward communication equipment. "I didn't mean to." The colonel's voice was barely audible, the words of someone trying to convince himself as much as anyone else that the assault had been accidental rather than the inevitable result of escalating aggression. His hands were shaking now, the physical manifestation of someone whose body was finally catching up to the emotional and professional catastrophe they had just created through their own actions. Elena's response carried the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a confused child. "Sir, intent is less relevant than action when it comes to military justice proceedings. You struck a subordinate during a disagreement about equipment requisitions while multiple witnesses observed the entire encounter. The circumstances and outcomes are clear regardless of your emotional state or intended level of force." Her words were delivered without malice, but they carried the weight of someone who understood exactly how military investigations would interpret what had just occurred. Torres was now looking between Elena and the door with the expression of someone trying to calculate how quickly he could distance himself from a situation that was certain to result in investigations, interviews, and career-ending consequences for everyone involved. His loyalty to the colonel was warring with his instinct for self-preservation, and the conflict was clearly visible in his increasingly panicked expression as he realized there was no good outcome available. The sound of approaching vehicles outside made everyone in the office freeze simultaneously, their heads turning toward the windows as if drawn by magnetic force. The rumble of multiple engines suggested official business rather than routine-based traffic, and the timing felt too coincidental to be unrelated to the confrontation that had just occurred. Elena remained calm, but there was something in her posture that suggested she was not surprised by the approaching sounds. Colonel Brock moved to the window and pulled back the blinds slightly, his face going even paler as he saw what was approaching the headquarters building. 3 black SUVs with official military plates were pulling into the parking area, their presence suggesting that word of the situation had somehow already reached higher command levels. Behind him, Elena stood with the composed bearing of someone who had been expecting this development rather than fearing it. "Sir," Torres said quietly, his voice carrying the tone of someone delivering news that he knew would not be welcome. "Those vehicles have general officer plates. All 3 of them." His observation hung in the air like a death sentence. The implications clear to everyone present that whatever was about to happen next would be handled at the highest levels of military command rather than through normal disciplinary channels that might have offered some hope of containment or mitigation. The sound of car doors slamming shut carried through the windows with the finality of closing caskets, each metallic crash seeming to seal Colonel Brock's fate a little more completely. Elena moved to the window beside him, her movements controlled and deliberate as she observed the approaching figures with the calm attention of someone who had been expecting this exact scenario to unfold. The red mark on her cheek had darkened slightly, creating a visible reminder of the assault that would be impossible to explain away or minimize. Torres felt his legs go weak as he recognized the insignia on the approaching officers' uniforms, even at a distance. "Those aren't just general officers, sir. That's Lieutenant General Morrison, Major General Vasquez, and Brigadier General Chun." His voice cracked slightly as he delivered this information, the names carrying weight that made everyone in the room understand that this situation had escalated far beyond anything that could be handled through normal command channels or personal connections. Colonel Brock's hands began to shake more violently as the implications of Torres's identification sank in fully. Lieutenant General Morrison commanded the entire regional theater, a man whose decisions affected thousands of personnel and millions of dollars in military assets. The presence of 3 general officers suggested either a pre-planned inspection of unprecedented importance or a response to an incident that had already reached the highest levels of military command through channels that bypassed normal reporting procedures. Elena stepped back from the window and moved to the center of the office, her posture shifting slightly into something that looked more like military attention than the relaxed bearing she had maintained throughout the morning's confrontation. There was something different about her now, a subtle change in presence that made everyone in the room suddenly aware that they might have been operating under fundamental misunderstandings about who they were dealing with and what her actual position might be within the military hierarchy. Captain Rodriguez finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Elena, I think you should know that these officers are going to want a complete account of what happened here. They're going to ask detailed questions about the assault, and there will probably be formal statements required from everyone who witnessed the incident." His words carried the careful tone of someone trying to prepare her for an ordeal that he assumed would be traumatic and overwhelming. Elena turned to look at Rodriguez with an expression that might have been amusement if the circumstances had been different. "Captain, I appreciate your concern, but I think you'll find that the questioning process may not proceed exactly as you're expecting. There are aspects of this situation that haven't been fully disclosed, and the general officer's response will likely reflect information that goes beyond what happened in this office this morning." Her words carried implications that seemed to hang in the air like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit together. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside grew louder and more distinct, the measured cadence of military personnel moving with purpose and authority. Colonel Brock moved away from the window and stood behind his desk, his hands gripping the edge of the wooden surface as if it might provide some stability in a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his control or comprehension. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, the physical manifestation of someone whose fight-or-flight response was activating despite the impossibility of either option. Torres positioned himself near the door, clearly uncertain about protocol for receiving general officers under these circumstances, but knowing that someone needed to maintain some semblance of military courtesy, even in the midst of what was obviously going to be a career-ending investigation. His face showed the strain of someone trying to process events that had moved far beyond his understanding or ability to influence, though his training kept him focused on immediate responsibilities rather than long-term implications. Major Hendricks had moved to his desk and was now standing at attention, his expression showing the kind of focused concentration that military personnel develop when they know they're about to be questioned by superior officers about events that could have serious consequences. Behind him, the communication equipment continued its quiet electronic humming, a reminder that everything happening in this office was taking place within a larger network of military operations and oversight that extended far beyond the base's boundaries. Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out what appeared to be a standard military identification card, though she held it in a way that suggested it might contain information that hadn't been previously shared with anyone in the room. The gesture was subtle, but it drew attention from everyone present as they realized that she might be preparing to reveal something that would fundamentally change their understanding of the morning's events and their own positions within the unfolding situation. The footsteps in the hallway had stopped directly outside the office door, followed by the kind of silence that precedes significant announcements or life-changing revelations. Colonel Brock's face had gone completely white now, the blood seeming to have drained from his features as he contemplated the immediate future and the various ways his career and reputation were about to be destroyed by his own actions and their inevitable consequences within the military justice system. A sharp knock on the door broke the silence with the authority of someone who expected immediate compliance rather than invitation. The sound seemed to reverberate through the office like a gong, marking the end of one phase of the situation and the beginning of something that everyone present sensed would be dramatically different from what had come before. Elena straightened slightly, her posture shifting into something that looked more like preparation for official proceedings than nervousness about impending questioning. Torres moved toward the door, his hand hesitating on the handle as he realized that opening it would officially begin whatever process was about to unfold. Behind him, Colonel Brock was staring at Elena with the expression of someone who was beginning to suspect that everything he had assumed about her identity and position might be fundamentally incorrect. The red mark on her cheek stood out starkly against her composed expression, a visible reminder of his assault that would be impossible to deny or explain away. Elena's voice carried clearly through the charged atmosphere as she addressed the room's occupants with something that sounded almost like gentle instruction. "Gentlemen, I suggest you prepare for a briefing that may require you to reconsider some of your assumptions about this morning's events and the people involved in them. The situation is about to become significantly more complex than anyone here has anticipated, and the next few minutes will likely change your understanding of everything that has occurred since I entered this office." The knock came again, more insistent this time, carrying the unmistakable authority of general officers who had traveled specifically to address a situation that had reached their attention through channels that suggested both urgency and serious consequences for all parties involved. Elena moved toward the door herself, her movement suggesting that she intended to control how the encounter proceeded rather than allowing others to manage her introduction to the arriving commanders. Elena reached for the door handle herself, her movement so natural and authoritative that Torres stepped back automatically without questioning why a supply sergeant was taking control of receiving general officers. The door opened to reveal three men whose combined authority could reshape entire military commands with a single decision, their expressions carrying the focused intensity of leaders who had been briefed on a situation that required immediate personal intervention rather than delegation through normal channels. Lieutenant General Morrison stepped into the office first, his eyes immediately scanning the room and its occupants before settling on Elena with recognition that struck everyone present like a physical blow. Behind him, Major General Vasquez and Brigadier General Chun entered with the measured bearing of officers who had traveled specifically to address a situation they already understood better than anyone currently in the room had realized was possible. Colonel Brock attempted to call the room to attention, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to maintain some semblance of normal protocol in circumstances that had clearly moved far beyond standard procedures. "Attention! General officers present." His words seemed to hang in the air awkwardly as the general's focus remained fixed on Elena, rather than acknowledging his attempt to establish proper military courtesy and chain of command recognition. Lieutenant General Morrison's expression darkened visibly as he noticed the red mark on Elena's cheek, his jaw tightening in a way that suggested the kind of controlled anger that general officers develop when dealing with situations that threaten military discipline and honor. "Colonel Vasquez, are you injured? Do you require medical attention before we proceed with this investigation?" His question dropped into the silence like a bomb, the casual use of Elena's actual rank causing everyone except the three generals to freeze in shocked comprehension. Torres felt the floor seem to shift beneath his feet as the implications of the general's words penetrated his understanding. "Colonel Vasquez, not Sergeant Vasquez. Colonel," the rank that placed her significantly above Lieutenant Colonel Brock in the military hierarchy, making his assault not just criminal, but an attack on a superior officer that carried even more serious consequences under military law and tradition. Elena touched her cheek gently and shook her head slightly. "No, sir, medical attention won't be necessary at this time. The assault was witnessed by multiple personnel, and I believe we should proceed with documenting the incident while the details remain fresh in everyone's memory." Her response carried the professional tone of someone accustomed to managing situations involving serious breaches of military discipline and protocol. Colonel Brock's legs seemed to give out slightly as he gripped his desk for support, the full magnitude of his mistake becoming clear as he realized he had not only assaulted a fellow officer, but had struck someone who outranked him by a significant margin. His face had gone beyond pale into a grayish tone that suggested someone whose body was struggling to process shock and horror simultaneously while maintaining basic consciousness and motor function. Major General Vasquez stepped forward, his movement carrying the authority of someone prepared to take control of a situation that required immediate command intervention. "Lieutenant Colonel Brock, you are hereby relieved of command pending investigation of assault charges against a superior officer. You will remain in this office under guard until military police arrive to escort you to confinement." His words were delivered with the finality of someone reading a sentence that had already been determined. Captain Rodriguez found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper of confused protest. "Sir, we were told she was assigned as supply personnel. Her identification showed Sergeant Vasquez, and her duty assignment was listed as logistic support. There must be some kind of administrative error or misunderstanding about her actual rank and position within the command structure." His explanation carried the desperate tone of someone trying to find rational explanations for events that had moved beyond rational comprehension. Brigadier General Chun addressed Rodriguez's confusion with the patient tone of someone explaining classified information that was now becoming necessarily public. "Colonel Vasquez has been conducting an undercover assessment of base operations and command effectiveness as part of a broader investigation into systemic issues within this theater. Her apparent assignment as support personnel was deliberate concealment designed to observe authentic command behaviors without the artificial courtesy that would accompany knowledge of her actual rank." Elena reached into her pocket and withdrew the identification card she had prepared earlier, revealing credentials that showed her actual rank, clearance level, and assignment to Inspector General Operations. The laminated card gleamed under the office lights, displaying information that fundamentally changed everyone's understanding of the morning's events and their own positions within what they now realized had been an official investigation rather than routine supply operations. Torres stared at the identification with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been reorganized around new information. "Colonel, ma'am, I apologize for any disrespect shown during your time here. We had no knowledge of your actual assignment or the nature of your presence on this base." His words carried the careful tone of someone trying to minimize their own culpability in a situation that had obviously involved multiple failures of protocol and professional behavior. Lieutenant General Morrison moved closer to Colonel Brock, his presence carrying the weight of someone prepared to deliver consequences that would permanently alter the accused officer's life and career. Lieutenant Colonel, your behavior toward Colonel Vasquez has been documented through multiple channels, including audio surveillance that was activated when her safety protocols indicated potential hostile situations. Your assault was recorded along with the events leading up to it, providing complete evidence for court-martial proceedings. The revelation that the entire confrontation had been recorded added another layer of devastation to Colonel Brock's situation, eliminating any possibility of disputed facts or alternative interpretations of events. His assault on a superior officer had been captured with the kind of complete documentation that would make defense strategies nearly impossible and conviction virtually certain under military justice proceedings. Elena stepped forward slightly, her movement drawing attention back to her role as both victim and investigating officer. Gentlemen, this incident represents exactly the kind of command climate issue that my investigation was designed to identify and document. The assumption that support personnel could be dismissed, threatened, and ultimately assaulted demonstrates systemic problems that extend beyond individual misconduct to institutional failures in leadership development and accountability. Major General Vasquez nodded grimly as he processed Elena's assessment and its implications for broader command responsibility. Colonel Vasquez, your investigation will now need to expand to include this base's entire leadership structure and training protocols. The failure to recognize inappropriate escalation patterns suggests problems that may affect multiple units and require comprehensive intervention at the theater level rather than individual disciplinary action. The sound of additional vehicles arriving outside indicated that military police and other investigative personnel were now responding to the situation with the urgency that assault charges against superior officers typically generated within military justice systems. Colonel Brock remained motionless behind his desk, his career and freedom both hanging in the balance as the consequences of his moment of uncontrolled rage continued to multiply around him like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. The sound of boots marching in formation echoed through the hallway as military police approached the office with the precision that accompanied serious criminal arrests rather than routine disciplinary actions. Elena moved to position herself where she could observe both the arriving MPs and the reactions of everyone in the room, her bearing now unmistakably that of a senior investigating officer rather than the supply clerk everyone had believed her to be for the past 6 months. Colonel Brock remained frozen behind his desk, his hands still gripping the wooden edge as if it might anchor him to a reality that was rapidly dissolving around him. The recorded evidence, the general officers, the revelation of Elena's true rank, all combined to create a situation where denial was impossible and mitigation unlikely. His eyes moved between Elena's face and the approaching sounds of his arrest with the desperate expression of someone searching for escape routes that simply did not exist. Torres had positioned himself against the far wall, clearly trying to minimize his presence in a situation that had moved far beyond his understanding or ability to influence. Captain Rodriguez and Major Hendricks stood at attention near their desks, their expressions showing the careful neutrality of officers who understood they were now witnesses in a criminal investigation rather than participants in routine command business that might be forgotten or overlooked. Lieutenant General Morrison stepped aside as 4 military police personnel entered the office, their movements coordinated and professional as they prepared to execute an arrest warrant that had obviously been prepared in advance rather than hastily drafted in response to immediate events. The lead MP sergeant carried documentation that suggested this intervention had been planned as a possible outcome of Elena's investigation rather than an unexpected development requiring improvised responses. Sergeant First Class Williams, the senior MP, approached Colonel Brock with the measured bearing of someone who had arrested senior officers before and understood the delicate balance between showing appropriate respect for rank while maintaining the authority necessary to execute criminal proceedings. Lieutenant Colonel Brock, you are under arrest for assault upon a superior officer, conduct unbecoming, and violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You have the right to remain silent and the right to legal counsel. Elena watched the arrest proceedings with the focused attention of someone documenting evidence for later testimony, her eyes noting details that would be important during court-martial proceedings. The red mark on her cheek remained visible, serving as physical evidence that would corroborate the recorded audio surveillance and witness testimony that would form the foundation of the prosecution's case against the disgraced lieutenant colonel. Colonel Brock offered no resistance as the MP secured his hands with restraints, his compliance suggesting someone whose spirit had been completely broken by the revelation of Elena's true identity and the magnitude of his mistake. "Sir, do you understand the charges being filed against you?" Sergeant Williams asked, his tone carrying the professional courtesy that military law required even when dealing with serious criminal violations and career-ending misconduct. The colonel's voice, when it finally emerged, was barely audible and carried none of the authority or confidence he had displayed earlier during his confrontation with Elena. "I understand." His acknowledgement seemed to seal his fate as completely as his signature on confession documents. Though everyone present understood that understanding charges and accepting consequences were different matters that would be resolved through formal legal proceedings rather than immediate admissions. Major General Vasquez addressed the remaining personnel in the office with the tone of someone delivering instructions that would affect their immediate futures and long-term career prospects. All personnel who witnessed this morning's events will be required to provide detailed statements to investigating officers. Your cooperation is mandatory, and your testimony will be crucial to ensuring proper justice and accountability within this command structure. Nobody leaves this base until complete statements have been recorded and verified. Torres stepped forward slightly, his movement hesitant as he prepared to ask questions that might affect his own position within the expanding investigation. "Sir, will our statements be used only for this specific incident, or are there broader implications for command personnel who were present during Colonel Vasquez's undercover assessment period?" His question carried the nervous energy of someone beginning to realize that his own actions and attitudes over the past 6 months might now be subject to official scrutiny. Elena addressed Torres's concerns with the patient tone of someone who had conducted numerous investigations and understood the anxiety that accompanied being questioned about professional conduct. "Staff Sergeant Torres, your statements will focus primarily on this morning's events, but investigators may ask about general command climate and interactions you observed during my assignment here. Honesty and completeness will be valued more than attempts to minimize or reinterpret events that were already under official observation." The MPs began escorting Colonel Brock toward the door, their movement creating a procession that would be visible to personnel throughout the headquarters building and would immediately signal that serious disciplinary action was taking place at the highest levels of base command. Elena followed behind them, her presence ensuring that proper protocols were maintained and that the physical evidence of her assault remained documented and protected for legal proceedings. Captain Rodriguez finally found his voice as the reality of the situation penetrated his shock at the morning's revelations. "Colonel Vasquez, ma'am, on behalf of the officers present, I want to apologize for any disrespect or inappropriate behavior you may have observed during your time here. We had no knowledge of your actual assignment, but that doesn't excuse failures to maintain proper military courtesy and professional standards regardless of perceived rank differences." Elena paused at the doorway and turned back to address the remaining personnel with an expression that combined understanding with professional assessment. "Captain, the purpose of undercover investigations is precisely to observe authentic behaviors rather than artificial courtesy. Your interactions, along with those of other personnel, will be evaluated within the context of normal command operations rather than the heightened awareness that would have accompanied knowledge of my actual position and assignment." Lieutenant General Morrison remained in the office as Elena departed with the MPs and their prisoner, his presence indicating that additional discussions would be necessary to address the broader implications of Elena's investigation and the systemic issues it had revealed. The general's expression suggested that Colonel Brock's arrest was only the beginning of changes that would affect multiple levels of command structure and operational procedures. Brigadier General Chun positioned himself near the communication equipment and began placing calls that would initiate broader investigative procedures and ensure that proper documentation was maintained throughout the expanding inquiry. His efficient movements suggested someone implementing pre-planned protocols rather than responding to unexpected developments, indicating that Elena's investigation had been conducted within a larger framework of oversight and accountability measures. The office felt different now, with Colonel Brock's removal and Elena's revelation, as if the very air had changed to reflect new power dynamics, an altered understanding of events that had been building for months. The morning sun continued streaming through the windows, but the light now illuminated a fundamentally changed environment where assumptions about rank, authority, and professional behavior had been completely reorganized around new information that affected everyone's position within the military hierarchy. The headquarters building had transformed into a hub of investigative activity as word of Colonel Brock's arrest spread through official channels with the speed that accompanied serious criminal charges against senior officers. Elena returned to the office after ensuring proper handoff of the prisoner to confinement facilities, her movements now openly displaying the authority and confidence that she had been carefully concealing during her 6 months of undercover assessment work on the base. Lieutenant General Morrison was reviewing documents that had been brought by his aide. Papers that suggested Elena's investigation had generated substantial documentation about command climate issues that extended far beyond the morning's assault incident. Major General Vasquez stood near the window observing base personnel who had gathered in small groups to discuss the dramatic events they had witnessed, their conversations creating an undercurrent of speculation and concern about broader implications for base operations. Torres remained at attention near his desk, clearly uncertain about protocol for interacting with someone he had spent months treating as support personnel, but who had now been revealed as a senior officer conducting official oversight of his professional behavior. His expression showed the strain of someone trying to recalibrate every interaction and conversation from the past 6 months through the lens of Elena's actual rank and investigative authority. Captain Rodriguez approached Elena with the careful bearing of someone seeking guidance about his immediate responsibilities and potential exposure within the expanding investigation. Colonel Vasquez, ma'am, should we be preparing comprehensive reports about base operations during your assessment period? Are there specific areas of concern that you observed beyond the communication equipment issues that triggered this morning's confrontation with Lieutenant Colonel Brock? Elena moved to Colonel Brock's former desk and began organizing materials that would be needed for the formal investigation, her actions demonstrating comfort with command authority that had been completely hidden during her time as an apparent supply sergeant. Captain, my assessment covered multiple aspects of base operations, including leadership effectiveness, resource allocation, personnel management, and adherence to military standards. The communication equipment concerns were legitimate operational issues that became useful for testing command responses to technical analysis from perceived subordinates. Brigadier General Chun finished his series of phone calls and turned his attention to the personnel who remained in the office, his expression showing the focused intensity of someone implementing procedures that would affect careers and potentially reshape base operations. All personnel present during this morning's events will be interviewed individually by Inspector General investigators who are en route from theater headquarters. Your statements will be recorded, transcribed, and used as evidence in both criminal proceedings and broader command assessment activities. Major Hendricks stepped forward with the hesitant movement of someone seeking clarification about his own position within the expanding investigation. Sir, will these interviews focus on our observations of Lieutenant Colonel Brock's behavior, or are we being evaluated for our own actions and responses during Colonel Vasquez's undercover assignment? His question carried the nervous energy of someone beginning to understand that witness status and subject status might not be mutually exclusive categories. Elena addressed his concerns with the professional tone of someone who had conducted numerous investigations involving multiple levels of personnel evaluation. Major, The interviews will primarily document your observations of this morning's assault and the events leading up to it. However, investigators may also ask about general command climate, your interactions with personnel at various rank levels, and your responses to situations that tested adherence to military values and professional standards during my assessment period. Lieutenant General Morrison looked up from his documents and addressed the group with the authority of someone whose decisions would determine how broadly the investigation expanded and what consequences would follow for various levels of personnel. This incident represents a failure of leadership development and command accountability that requires comprehensive review. Colonel Vasquez's investigation has identified systemic issues that affect unit readiness, personnel management, and adherence to core military values throughout this command structure. The sound of additional vehicles arriving outside indicated that the investigative team from theater headquarters was beginning to arrive with the equipment and personnel necessary to conduct formal interviews and evidence collection. Elena moved to the window and observed their arrival with the satisfaction of someone whose careful planning was now being implemented through proper institutional channels rather than improvised responses to unexpected developments. Torres finally found the courage to address Elena directly, his voice carrying the careful respect that he should have been showing throughout her 6-month assignment if he had understood her actual rank and position. Colonel Vasquez, ma'am, I want to formally apologize for any disrespectful behavior or inappropriate comments you may have observed during your time here. Staff Sergeant Torres spoke or acted without awareness of your actual authority, and I accept responsibility for failures to maintain proper military courtesy regardless of perceived rank differences. Elena turned from the window to face Torres with an expression that combined understanding with professional assessment of his character and potential for growth within military service. Staff Sergeant, your apology is noted and appreciated. The purpose of undercover assessment is to observe authentic leadership behaviors and professional interactions. Your conduct will be evaluated within that context, and investigators will be more interested in patterns of behavior than individual moments of disrespect that occurred without knowledge of my actual assignment. Major General Vasquez began organizing materials for transfer to the incoming investigative team, his movements suggesting someone implementing procedures that had been developed specifically for situations where undercover assessments revealed serious command climate problems. The documentation Elena had gathered during her 6 months would now become evidence in multiple proceedings that could affect careers, unit assignments, and broader military policies about leadership development and accountability measures. Captain Rodriguez approached Elena with forms that appear to be official documentation requiring her signature as the investigating officer and assault victim. Ma'am, these are preliminary incident reports that need your review and approval before being forwarded to military justice for court-martial preparation. The charges against Lieutenant Colonel Brock include assault upon a superior officer, conduct unbecoming, and violation of direct orders regarding professional military conduct. Elena reviewed the documents with the careful attention of someone whose signature would initiate legal proceedings that would permanently alter another officer's life and career. The forms contained detailed descriptions of the morning's events, witness lists, and preliminary assessments of evidence that would support prosecution efforts during formal court-martial proceedings. Her careful review demonstrated the thoroughness that characterized her approach to both investigative work and documentation requirements. The office door opened to admit a team of Inspector General investigators carrying equipment for formal interviews and evidence collection, their arrival marking the transition from immediate crisis response to systematic documentation and analysis of events that had broader implications for military leadership and accountability. Elena greeted them with the professional courtesy of someone whose careful planning had created the foundation for their current investigative activities. Brigadier General Chun addressed the arriving investigators with briefing materials that outlined the scope of Elena's undercover assessment and the documentation she had gathered about command climate issues during her 6-month assignment. The assault incident this morning represents the culmination of systemic problems that Colonel Vasquez identified through careful observation of leadership behaviors and professional interactions at multiple levels of this command structure. Elena prepared to transfer responsibility for the expanded investigation to the Inspector General team while maintaining her role as both primary witness to the assault and investigating officer who had documented broader command climate issues. The red mark on her cheek had faded slightly, but remained visible as physical evidence that would be photographed and documented as part of the formal criminal case against Lieutenant Colonel Brock, ensuring that his moment of uncontrolled rage would have permanent consequences. The Inspector General team established their operations center in the conference room adjacent to the former command office, their efficient setup creating an environment designed for formal interviews and evidence review that would determine the scope and consequences of the expanding investigation. Elena provided them with 6 months of carefully documented observations, recordings, and analysis that painted a comprehensive picture of command climate issues that extended far beyond individual misconduct to institutional failures requiring systematic intervention. Colonel Patricia Brennan, the lead IG investigator, reviewed Elena's assessment materials with the focused attention of someone whose findings would influence careers, unit assignments, and potentially broader military policies about leadership development and accountability measures. Colonel Vasquez, your documentation suggests that Lieutenant Colonel Brock's behavior this morning was consistent with patterns of dismissive treatment toward perceived subordinates that you observed throughout your assignment here. Is that an accurate assessment of the command climate you encountered? Elena positioned herself where she could observe both the investigators and the personnel waiting to be interviewed, her bearing now unmistakably that of a senior officer whose authority had been earned through years of experience rather than temporary assignment or bureaucratic positioning. Colonel Brennan, my observations documented systematic failures to maintain professional courtesy, evaluate personnel based on merit rather than assumptions, and respond appropriately to legitimate operational concerns regardless of their source. Lieutenant Colonel Brock's assault represents the extreme end of behavioral patterns that affected multiple interactions throughout this command. Torres waited in the hallway outside the conference room, his expression showing the nervous energy of someone preparing to account for 6 months of professional behavior that he now understood had been under official observation and evaluation. Behind him, Captain Rodriguez and Major Hendricks engaged in quiet conversation about their own potential exposure within an investigation that seemed to be expanding beyond witness statements to comprehensive review of leadership effectiveness and adherence to military standards. Lieutenant General Morrison entered the conference room, carrying additional documentation that suggested Elena's investigation was part of a broader assessment of regional command effectiveness that had been ongoing for months through multiple channels and bases. Colonel Vasquez, your findings align with concerns that have been identified through other assessment mechanisms within this theater. The assault incident provides clear evidence of systemic problems that require immediate intervention and long-term institutional changes to prevent recurrence. Colonel Brennan began reviewing audio recordings that had been captured during Elena's 6 months of undercover work, the electronic surveillance having documented numerous interactions that revealed attitudes and behaviors that contradicted official military values and professional standards. These recordings will be crucial evidence, not only for Lieutenant Colonel Brock's court-martial, but also for determining whether other personnel require counseling, training, or disciplinary action based on their demonstrated conduct toward perceived subordinates. Elena watched through the conference room window as base personnel continued gathering in small groups throughout the headquarters area, their conversations creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and speculation about how broadly the investigation would affect careers and assignments. The visible presence of general officers and IG investigators had created awareness that significant changes were coming to base operations and leadership structure, though the specific details remained unknown to most personnel. Major Hendricks was called for his interview first, his movement toward the conference room carrying the careful bearing of someone who understood that his professional future might depend on his ability to provide accurate and complete testimony about events he had witnessed and participated in during Elena's assessment period. Behind him, Torres and Rodriguez exchanged glances that suggested growing awareness of their own vulnerability within the expanding investigation. Colonel Brennan addressed Elena with questions that would help establish the broader context for the morning's assault incident within the systematic command climate problems she had documented during her undercover assignment. Colonel, beyond the communication equipment issue that precipitated this morning's confrontation, were there other instances where Lieutenant Colonel Brock demonstrated dismissive or inappropriate behavior toward personnel he perceived as subordinate to his authority? Elena provided detailed responses that drew from months of careful observation and documentation. Her testimony creating a comprehensive picture of leadership failures that had created an environment where assault could occur as the predictable escalation of established patterns rather than an isolated incident of individual misconduct. Colonel Brock consistently demonstrated inability to evaluate personnel based on merit, listen to legitimate operational concerns, or maintain professional courtesy when dealing with individuals he assumed held lower rank or less authority than his own position. The first interview with Major Hendricks lasted over an hour, his detailed testimony apparently providing information that supported Elena's assessment of systemic command climate problems that required institutional intervention beyond individual disciplinary action. When he emerged from the conference room, his expression showed the strain of someone who had been required to provide honest assessment of his own professional behavior and that of his colleagues under circumstances where accuracy was mandatory and consequences were significant. Torres entered for his interview with the nervous energy of someone whose entire understanding of military professionalism had been reorganized by the morning's revelations about Elena's true identity and investigative authority. His 6 months of interactions with her would now be evaluated through the lens of proper military courtesy and adherence to values that should have governed his behavior regardless of his assumptions about her rank or assignment. Elena continued providing context and analysis to Colonel Brennan while the individual interviews proceeded, her comprehensive assessment serving as the foundation for understanding how Lieutenant Colonel Brock's assault had emerged from broader patterns of institutional failure rather than isolated personal misconduct. The documentation she had gathered would support both criminal prosecution and administrative actions designed to address systemic problems affecting unit readiness and personnel management. Captain Rodriguez waited for his interview with the focused attention of someone reviewing 6 months of professional interactions through a completely different lens than he had previously applied to his daily behavior and decision-making processes. The knowledge that a senior investigating officer had been observing and documenting his conduct created retrospective awareness of moments when his behavior might not have met the standards expected of military professionals. Colonel Brennan reviewed Elena's assessment of broader institutional issues that had created an environment where dismissive treatment of perceived subordinates was normalized rather than corrected through proper leadership intervention and accountability measures. Your investigation suggests that Lieutenant Colonel Brock's behavior was enabled by systemic failures in leadership development and command oversight that extend beyond this base to broader institutional problems requiring comprehensive intervention at multiple levels. Elena nodded as she observed the ongoing interview process that would determine how broadly accountability would be applied and what institutional changes would be implemented to prevent recurrence of the command climate problems she had documented. The assault this morning represents the inevitable escalation of patterns that were allowed to persist without proper intervention. Addressing individual misconduct without correcting systemic failures would only ensure that similar incidents occur elsewhere within commands that operate under comparable leadership deficiencies. The investigation was expanding systematically as each interview revealed additional information about command climate issues that had been normalized over time rather than addressed through proper military leadership and accountability measures. Elena's 6 months of careful documentation had created the foundation for institutional changes that would extend far beyond Lieutenant Colonel Brock's court-martial to comprehensive review of leadership development, personnel management, and adherence to core military values throughout the theater command structure. The investigation had been proceeding for 3 hours when Colonel Brennan called Elena back into the conference room for a final assessment that would determine the scope of recommendations to be forwarded to theater command for implementation. The interviews with base personnel had revealed a pattern of normalized disrespect and institutional failure that extended far beyond Lieutenant Colonel Brock's individual misconduct to systemic problems requiring comprehensive intervention and long-term institutional changes throughout the command structure. Elena reviewed the preliminary findings with the focused attention of someone whose 6 months of careful documentation was now being transformed into formal recommendations that would affect careers, unit assignments, and broader military policies about leadership development and accountability measures. Colonel Brennan, the evidence supports implementation of comprehensive leadership training, enhanced oversight procedures, and systematic evaluation of command climate issues throughout this theater to prevent recurrence of the institutional failures that enabled this morning's assault. Lieutenant General Morrison entered the conference room carrying orders that had been prepared at theater headquarters based on preliminary reports about Elena's investigation and the assault incident that had provided clear evidence of systemic command climate problems requiring immediate intervention. Colonel Vasquez, your investigation has exceeded expectations in documenting institutional failures that affect unit readiness and personnel management throughout this region. The findings will support broader changes to leadership development and accountability measures across multiple installations. Colonel Brennan presented her preliminary report with recommendations that included immediate relief of additional command personnel, mandatory leadership training for all senior officers, enhanced oversight procedures for personnel management, and systematic evaluation of command climate issues through regular assessments designed to identify problems before they escalated to criminal misconduct. The documentation Elena had provided created an irrefutable foundation for institutional changes that would extend far beyond this base to theater-wide reforms. Elena observed the finalization of her investigation with the professional satisfaction of someone whose careful work had achieved its intended purpose of identifying and documenting systemic problems that required institutional intervention rather than individual disciplinary action alone. The assault this morning provided dramatic evidence of failures that had been building for months, but the underlying command climate issues affected daily operations, personnel development, and unit effectiveness in ways that compromised military readiness and professional standards. Torres completed his interview and emerged from the conference room with the subdued expression of someone who had been required to provide honest assessment of his own professional behavior and that of his colleagues under circumstances where accuracy was mandatory and consequences were significant. His testimony had apparently corroborated Elena's observations about normalized patterns of disrespect and institutional failure that had created an environment where assault could occur as predictable escalation rather than isolated incident. Major General Vasquez reviewed the expanding scope of personnel actions that would result from Elena's investigation. The list including immediate relief of command for additional officers, mandatory counseling and training for middle management personnel, and comprehensive review of promotion and assignment procedures to ensure that leadership positions were filled by individuals capable of maintaining proper military standards and professional behavior regardless of their personal attitudes or biases. Captain Rodriguez completed his interview with information that had apparently provided additional evidence supporting Elena's assessment of systemic command climate problems affecting multiple levels of personnel and daily operations throughout the base. His detailed testimony about interactions he had witnessed and participated in during Elena's 6-month assignment created documentation that would support both individual disciplinary actions and broader institutional reforms designed to prevent recurrence of the failures that had enabled the morning's assault. Elena prepared her final assessment report with comprehensive recommendations for institutional changes that addressed not only the immediate command climate problems she had documented, but also broader military policies about leadership development, personnel evaluation, and accountability measures designed to ensure that similar investigations would be unnecessary in future assignments. Her 6 months of careful observation had created a blueprint for systemic reforms that would extend far beyond this installation to theater-wide implementation. Colonel Brennan finalized the formal investigation report that would be forwarded to theater headquarters for implementation through proper command channels. The document containing detailed evidence of institutional failures that required comprehensive intervention rather than individual disciplinary action alone. The assault incident had provided dramatic illustration of problems that affected daily operations, personnel management, and unit effectiveness in ways that compromised military readiness and adherence to core professional values. Lieutenant General Morrison signed orders that implemented immediate changes to base command structure, including relief of additional personnel whose behavior during Elena's investigation had demonstrated inability to maintain proper military standards and professional courtesy regardless of their assumptions about rank or authority. The scope of personnel actions reflected the systemic nature of problems that Elena's investigation had documented through months of careful observation and analysis. Elena completed her transition briefing to the permanent IG team that would continue monitoring base operations to ensure proper implementation of recommended changes and prevent recurrence of the command climate problems that had enabled Lieutenant Colonel Brock's assault and other failures of military professionalism. Her investigation had achieved its intended purpose of identifying institutional problems that required systematic intervention rather than individual accountability alone. Major Hendricks was informed that his interview had revealed behavior patterns that required additional leadership training and enhanced supervision to ensure proper adherence to military values and professional standards in future assignments. His conduct during Elena's 6-month assessment had demonstrated areas for improvement that would be addressed through mandatory development programs rather than punitive disciplinary action, reflecting the institutional approach to addressing systemic problems. The base transformation was beginning as new command personnel arrived to replace those who had been relieved based on Elena's investigation and the assault incident that had provided clear evidence of institutional failures affecting unit readiness and personnel management. Elena observed the implementation of her recommendations with professional satisfaction, knowing that her careful documentation had created lasting changes that would prevent similar problems from developing in future assignments. Torres received notification that his conduct during Elena's investigation had been evaluated as generally appropriate with areas for improvement that would be addressed through additional training rather than disciplinary action. His honest testimony and willingness to acknowledge mistakes had demonstrated character and potential for professional growth that warranted continued military service under enhanced supervision and development programs designed to ensure proper adherence to military values. Elena prepared for departure to her next assignment with the knowledge that her investigation had achieved its intended purpose of identifying and documenting systemic problems that required institutional intervention to ensure proper military leadership and accountability measures. The assault incident had provided dramatic evidence of failures that affected military readiness and professional standards, but the underlying command climate issues had been comprehensively addressed through her careful work and thorough documentation that would support lasting institutional changes throughout the theater command structure. 2 weeks had passed since the assault incident when Elena returned to Fort Meridian for the final phase of her investigation. Observing the implementation of institutional changes and evaluating the effectiveness of new leadership in addressing the command climate problems that her undercover assessment had documented. The base felt dramatically different under new management, with an atmosphere of professional respect and accountability that had replaced the casual dismissiveness and institutional failures that had characterized daily operations during her 6-month assignment. Colonel Marcus Steinberg, the new base commander, greeted Elena with the professional courtesy and recognition that her rank and assignment warranted, his approach demonstrating the kind of leadership competence that should have characterized her entire experience at Fort Meridian. Colonel Vasquez, Your investigation has provided the foundation for comprehensive changes that are already improving unit effectiveness and personnel satisfaction throughout this installation. The transformation has been remarkable to observe and participate in during the transition period. Elena moved through the headquarters building with her actual authority now recognized and respected, observing interactions between personnel that reflected proper military courtesy and professional behavior rather than the normalized patterns of disrespect and institutional failure that had enabled Lieutenant Colonel Brock's assault and other misconduct. The communication equipment concerns that had triggered the morning's confrontation had been addressed immediately, with proper evaluation procedures established for technical recommendations regardless of their source. Torres approached Elena with the respectful bearing of someone who had learned important lessons about military professionalism and personal accountability during the investigation and its aftermath. Colonel Vasquez, ma'am, I wanted to personally thank you for the professional development opportunities that resulted from your investigation. The additional training and enhanced supervision have helped me understand proper military values and courtesy that should have governed my behavior throughout your assignment here. Elena acknowledged his growth with the satisfaction of someone whose investigation had achieved its intended purpose of creating positive institutional changes rather than merely punishing individual misconduct. Staff Sergeant Torres, your willingness to learn and improve demonstrates the kind of character and potential that makes comprehensive reform possible. The institutional changes implemented here will benefit personnel throughout this installation and serve as a model for broader military leadership development. Captain Rodriguez, now serving under enhanced supervision as part of his professional development plan, demonstrated markedly improved leadership behavior and adherence to military standards in his interactions with personnel at all rank levels. Colonel Vasquez, the leadership training programs implemented based on your recommendations have provided valuable insights into proper command, climate management, and professional courtesy that should have been part of my development much earlier in my career. Elena observed training sessions where new leadership development programs addressed the specific issues her investigation had identified, with comprehensive instruction about proper military courtesy, effective communication across rank levels, and accountability measures designed to prevent the kind of institutional failures that had enabled systematic disrespect and normalized misconduct throughout the previous command structure. The training was mandatory for all personnel and would be implemented throughout the theater based on our documented findings. Major Hendricks had been transferred to a staff position where his professional development could continue under direct supervision. His new assignment providing opportunities for growth while ensuring that enhanced oversight prevented recurrence of the behavioral patterns that Elena's investigation had documented during his time in the previous command structure. His willingness to acknowledge mistakes and commit to improvement had been factored into decisions about his continued military service. The new communications equipment had been installed and was functioning effectively, with proper procedures established for evaluating technical recommendations based on merit rather than assumptions about their source or the perceived rank of personnel providing analysis. Elena reviewed the operational improvements with professional satisfaction, knowing that legitimate safety concerns would now receive appropriate consideration regardless of institutional biases or personal prejudices that had previously affected decision-making processes. Elena met with Colonel Brennan to review the final assessment of institutional changes and their effectiveness in addressing the command climate problems that had been documented during her 6-month undercover assignment. Colonel, the transformation has exceeded expectations in terms of both immediate behavioral changes and systematic implementation of procedures designed to prevent recurrence of the institutional failures that enabled Lieutenant Colonel Brock's assault and other misconduct. Lieutenant General Morrison arrived for a final briefing about the success of Elena's investigation and its broader implications for theater-wide implementation of similar assessment procedures and institutional reforms. Colonel Vasquez, your work has provided a model for proactive identification and correction of command climate problems before they escalate to criminal misconduct or compromise unit effectiveness and military readiness. The procedures developed here will be implemented throughout the region. Elena prepared her final report with comprehensive documentation of the institutional transformation that had resulted from her investigation, including specific metrics about improved personnel satisfaction, enhanced operational effectiveness, and systematic adherence to military values and professional standards that had replaced the normalized patterns of disrespect and institutional failure that had characterized the previous command structure. The changes were measurable and sustainable. Colonel Steinberg implemented weekly command climate assessments designed to identify potential problems before they could develop into the kind of systematic issues that Elena's investigation had documented, with regular evaluation procedures that would ensure continued adherence to proper military leadership and accountability measures. The proactive approach represented a fundamental shift from reactive discipline to preventive leadership development and institutional oversight. Elena reviewed personnel files showing improved performance evaluations and professional development outcomes for individuals who had received additional training and enhanced supervision rather than purely punitive disciplinary action, demonstrating the effectiveness of institutional approaches to addressing command climate problems through comprehensive reform rather than individual accountability alone. The balanced approach had produced lasting positive changes throughout the base. Torres had been selected for advanced leadership training based on his demonstrated growth and commitment to professional improvement during the investigation and its aftermath, his development serving as an example of how proper institutional response to documented problems could create opportunities for individual advancement rather than merely punitive consequences. His selection reflected the comprehensive nature of the reforms that Elena's investigation had initiated. Elena completed her transition to the permanent oversight team that would continue monitoring base operations and evaluating the long-term effectiveness of institutional changes in maintaining proper command climate and preventing recurrence of the systematic problems that her investigation had identified and documented. Her careful work had created lasting improvements that would benefit military personnel and operational effectiveness for years to come. The base had been fundamentally transformed through Elena's investigation and the comprehensive institutional changes that had resulted from her careful documentation of command climate problems. Creating an environment where proper military values and professional standards were maintained through effective leadership and accountability measures rather than allowed to deteriorate through institutional neglect and normalized misconduct. Her work had achieved its intended purpose completely. 6 months after Lieutenant Colonel Brock's court-martial conviction and sentencing, Elena stood in the same headquarters office where she had been assaulted, now observing a command environment that exemplified proper military leadership and institutional accountability. The transformation had been complete and lasting, with new procedures and leadership development programs creating sustainable changes that prevented the kind of systematic failures that had enabled assault and other misconduct to occur as predictable escalation of normalized disrespect. Colonel Steinberg presented Elena with a commendation recognizing her investigation's contribution to theater-wide improvements in command climate and military professionalism. The award representing institutional acknowledgement that her careful work had created lasting positive changes extending far beyond Fort Meridian to comprehensive reforms affecting leadership development and accountability measures throughout the regional command structure. Your investigation has become the standard for proactive assessment and institutional reform throughout our theater of operations. Elena accepted the recognition with the professional satisfaction of someone whose difficult and dangerous undercover work had achieved its intended purpose of identifying and correcting systemic problems before they could compromise military readiness or harm additional personnel through continued institutional failure and normalized misconduct. The assault incident had provided dramatic evidence of deeper issues, but the comprehensive response had addressed root causes rather than merely punishing individual behavior. Torres, now serving as a senior non-commissioned officer after completing advanced leadership training, approached Elena with the respectful bearing and professional competence that reflected his genuine growth during the investigation and its aftermath. Colonel Vasquez, Ma'am, your investigation changed my understanding of military professionalism and personal accountability in ways that have shaped my entire approach to leadership and service. I wanted to express gratitude for the development opportunities that resulted from honest assessment of my previous behavior. Elena observed the daily operations that now reflected proper military courtesy and effective communication across all rank levels, with personnel demonstrating the kind of professional behavior and institutional commitment that should have characterized her entire 6-month assignment, rather than requiring undercover investigation to document failures and implement comprehensive reforms. The changes were visible in every interaction and operational procedure throughout the installation. Captain Rodriguez, now serving effectively under the Enhanced Leadership Development Program, demonstrated markedly improved professional judgment and adherence to military values in his management responsibilities and personnel interactions. Colonel Vasquez, the institutional changes implemented based on your investigation have created an environment where proper military leadership can flourish and personnel can develop their full potential without the barriers and biases that previously affected advancement and professional recognition. Elena reviewed final documentation showing sustained improvements in personnel satisfaction, operational effectiveness, and adherence to military standards throughout the base and similar installations where her investigation's findings had been implemented through comprehensive reform programs. The metrics demonstrated that institutional changes had created lasting positive outcomes rather than temporary compliance that might deteriorate without continued oversight and accountability measures. Lieutenant General Morrison arrived for a final assessment meeting that would determine whether Elena's investigation model would be expanded to additional theaters and installations throughout the military. Her successful identification and correction of systematic command climate problems having demonstrated the value of proactive assessment rather than reactive response to misconduct and institutional failure. Colonel Vasquez, your methodology has proven effective beyond our initial expectations and will be implemented broadly. Elena prepared her comprehensive final report documenting the complete transformation of Fort Meridian from an installation characterized by normalized disrespect and institutional failure to a model of proper military leadership and professional accountability that now served as a training site for other commanders seeking to implement similar improvements in their own units and installations. The changes have been thorough, sustainable, and measurable in their positive impact. The communication equipment that had originally triggered the confrontation leading to Lieutenant Colonel Brock's assault was now functioning effectively as part of comprehensive operational improvements that reflected proper evaluation procedures and technical decision-making based on merit rather than institutional biases or personal prejudices. Elena's legitimate safety concerns have been addressed immediately upon revelation of her actual rank and investigative authority. Elena met with the permanent oversight team that would continue monitoring Fort Meridian's progress while expanding similar assessment and reform procedures to additional installations throughout the theater. Her investigation having created a systematic approach to identifying and correcting command climate problems before they could escalate to criminal misconduct or compromise unit effectiveness and military readiness. The model would benefit countless personnel and operations. Colonel Brennan provided final statistics showing the broader impact of Elena's investigation, including reduced misconduct rates, improved personnel retention, enhanced operational effectiveness, and increased adherence to military values throughout installations where similar reforms have been implemented based on her documented findings and institutional recommendations. The positive outcomes extended far beyond the immediate resolution of problems at Fort Meridian. Elena observed a promotion ceremony where Torres and other personnel who had demonstrated genuine growth and professional development during the investigation were recognized for their commitment to improvement and adherence to proper military standards. Their advancement reflecting the institutional emphasis on development and opportunity rather than purely punitive responses to documented behavioral problems. The ceremony exemplified the positive transformation that comprehensive reform could achieve. If this story moved you, drop a comment about what resonated most with you. or share if you've witnessed similar courage in real life. Sometimes the most powerful transformations come from those who quietly observe, document, and work for systematic change rather than seeking immediate recognition or personal vindication. The final phase of Elena's investigation concluded with her assignment to lead a new theater-wide program for proactive command climate assessment. Her successful work at Fort Meridian, having demonstrated that careful observation and comprehensive institutional response could prevent serious misconduct while creating opportunities for positive professional development and lasting improvement in military leadership and accountability. Her patient, professional approach had achieved transformation that extended far beyond individual punishment to systematic institutional reform. Elena departed Fort Meridian knowing that her 6 months of careful documentation and the dramatic mourning that had revealed her true identity had created lasting positive changes that would benefit military personnel and operational effectiveness for years to come. The assault that had seemed like a moment of personal attack had become the catalyst for comprehensive reforms that improved professional standards and institutional accountability throughout the regional command structure. The headquarters building, where she had been struck by Lieutenant Colonel Brock, now housed leadership training programs based on her investigation's findings. With new commanders learning proper military courtesy and effective personnel management through comprehensive education rather than discovering these principles through disciplinary action and criminal prosecution. Her work had prevented similar incidents while creating opportunities for positive growth and institutional improvement that reflected the best values of military service.